Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In last week's podcast, we treated an incident involving David that appeared to be completely devoid of religious activity or theological import. This week, we will deal with a story narrated in 1 Samuel 30, which accents religious activity and theological significance. Remember that David and his men had been prevented from joining the Philistines as they warred against Israel. When David and his army left the Philistines, they arrived in Ziklag. However, when they got there, they realized that Ziklag had suffered a crushing defeat at the hand of the Amalekites. The Amalekites had not only razed the city, but carried off the people. Those carried off included not only men, but women and children. David and his men were completely distraught about what had happened. They lamented to the point of exhaustion. Of course, because women had been captured, David's two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, Nabal's widow, were among the captives. This raid had been so devastating that his men turned on David. After all, they too had lost wives and children. David was in danger of being stoned on the spot. That's in the first 6 verses of chapter 30 of 1 Samuel. At this point in the story, David found strength in his religion. Without elaboration, we are told that, quote, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God, end of quote. That's in verse 6. Did this mean that he prayed? Did this mean that he meditated? Did this mean that he reminded himself of the characteristics of the deity he worshipped? Did it mean he sacrificed? We do not know. However, somehow he weathered this storm by counting on his religious resources. Then David became even more proactive. He asked the priest Abiathar to bring him the ephod. An ephod is a vestment worn by a priest when engaging in sacerdotal activities. David would use this ephod as a means for inquiring of the Lord, a technical term for seeking God's will. David asked God whether he should pursue those who had been responsible for this terrible devastation. God told him to do exactly that. That's in verses 7 and 8. Once David heard this word from God, he took his 600 men to rectify the situation. However, since at least 200 of his men were too tired to fight, David continued his pursuit with only 400 men. This group was divided at the brook named Besor. That's in verses 9 and 10. On the way, they happened on an Egyptian man in the open country. He was in bad shape. David's men saw to it that the man was fed and given something to drink. The man had been without food and water for 3 days. Fortunately, David's provisions allowed the man to gain his strength. When he felt better, he was peppered with questions from David. David wanted to know from what group this man had come and where he was from originally. The man responded that he was an Egyptian allied with the Amalekites. He had been left behind when he fell ill. Before that, though, he noted that the people he was with had raided the Negev, which was occupied by Kerethites and Judeans, and also the Negev which belonged to Caleb. In that same raid, they had razed Ziklag. That's in verses 11 through 14. Once David heard this, David asked the man to show him where this army was. Obviously, the Egyptian man became afraid. He agreed to supply this information on the condition that his life be spared. This condition was apparently accepted. That's in verse 15. When David and his men were brought to those who had done these raids, they found them in a celebratory mood. They were eating, drinking, and even dancing. After all, they had taken so much booty from the Philistines and from Judah. David wasted no time. David and his army tore into these raiders and defeated them thoroughly. Only 400 managed to escape. That's in verses 16 and 17. The result of this victory was that David was able to recover everything that had been taken. This included his 2 wives. As a bonus, David also captured flocks and herds, which was later dubbed David's spoil. That's in verses 18 through 20. After this, David and his men returned to the 200 men who had been left behind because they had been too exhausted to fight. When the 200 men saw David approach, they went out to greet their captain. David saluted them when he saw them. But some of the people who fought with David were not nearly as magnanimous. The narrator describes them as wicked and base fellows, and they were not interested in sharing the spoil with those who had not fought by their sides. They had no problem with the 200 going home with wives and children, but that was all they were willing to concede. All of a sudden, David had a badly divided group on his hands. That's verses 20 through 21. David immediately intervened in this dispute. Plus, he used a religious rationale to make his point. David insisted that God was responsible for their recent fortune. God was behind this victory and therefore also responsible for the recovery and the new spoil. David went on to say that even troops who supported the efforts by staying back with the gear were just as important as the troops who fought. For that reason, everyone should be willing to share. David thought that this was not only the right thing to do in this situation, but from now on as well. So he made it a regulation that his troops would implement henceforth. That's in verses 23 to 25. When David got back to Ziklag, he made sure that the elders of Judah received some of the spoil that came from this campaign. He made this present with consummate religious language. Quote, "Here is a present for you for the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." End of quote. David deflected from his own military exploits and gave God all the credit. Was he being sincere? Or was this a political ploy? That question is not answered explicitly. At the same time, the cities were listed that were benefited by David's sharing of the spoil: Bethel, Ramoth, Yatir, Aror, Siphmoth, Eshtemoa, Rakau, in the cities of the Jeremites, in the cities of the Kenites, in Hormah, in Borashan, in Atak, and in Hebron. All these places were where David and his army had been exerting their military efforts. Whether calculated or not, David had greatly enhanced his standing among the people he would soon be in a position to rule. That's in verses 26 to 31. It is curious that the books of Samuel present David in such a mixed fashion. A few stories describe David's actions with virtually no religious implications. For the most part, the political implications are quite clear, even obvious. As long as Saul remains Israel's king, David has no choice but to bide his time. Even when Saul dies, David is able to rule only over a part of Israel. For 7 years, the house of Saul and the house of David share the kingship. Granted, eventually, David becomes the sole ruler. In the broad sweep of the narrative, David's rule was indeed divinely sanctioned. But on the way to that result, there were many stories that emphasized realpolitik, biblical style. At times, the text stressed David's uncommon political savvy. At other times, his religious deportment comes to the fore. Once in a while, David's political instincts and his religious instincts seem synchronized. In short, when we pay attention to textual detail, David's story is highly nuanced, greatly textured, and immensely complex. David is no plastic character. As it turns out, that depiction of David will continue when he is Israel's only king, at least according to the books of Samuel. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I have a way to contact you. And if you have a question you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.